ask, you circulated some papers, which of course we've all read in advance.
All right, thank you, Patrick. And
okay,
share my screen.
Thank you. And I'll remind you after about 30 minutes, and we'll try to finish in 35.
All right, thank you. I need the right to share my screen. I can't right now.
Okay, I think.
1 second.
Thank you.
Ready.
Okay, good. Yes. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, perfectly. Brilliant. Thank you.
Good. Thank
Take it away.
you. All right, I just want to put your faces on the other screen so I can see everybody. Good. Awesome. All right, so, well, I just start by introducing very briefly myself. I'm Claudia Lunge. I work at the Laboratoire de Système Perceptif in Paris. I work on vision, visual plasticity, and multisensory perception. But today I'm going to talk about theoretical controversies in the basis of visual awareness. And I would like to keep this as informal as possible. So if you have any questions, if something's not clear during the presentation, just unmute yourself, stop me, and go for it. I think it's very good if we interact as much as possible. All right, so I'm gonna start by telling you about the phenomenon, the visual phenomenon that is at the basis of this controversy. And the phenomenon is actually what we call visual distability. And visual distability occurs anytime that we have a figure that can be interpreted into different ways. And so, for example, I will show you some very famous ambiguous figures, starting with with the Necker cube. You perhaps are all familiar with it. So in this case, in these ambiguous figures, the interpretation of the 3D configuration of the Necker cube is ambiguous. So your perception, actually, when you look at the cube and you stare at the cube for quite a few seconds, will actually switch between two different interpretations of the cube. One in which one of the faces of the cube faces the front, and then goes back to the back of the cube. Are you all seeing that? Have you seen already the cube switching? Okay. Another very, very famous case of visual distability or ambiguous figures is what is called the young lady, the old lady and the young girl, or also the original title of the figure was My Wife and My Mother-in-Law, which I find pretty funny. So in these ambiguous figures, the two interpretations of the figures are actually the face of an old lady with the nose being here and the chin, or a young girl with a nice hat, in which this will be the nose of the young girl. And I hope you have had the chance yet to see both configuration, both interpretation of the image. Another very famous ambiguous image is the Rubin phase-based illusion, in which is a background segregation, figure background segregation ambiguity, in which you can either perceive in the image a vase or two faces. You can see the profiles of the two faces that actually constitute the background. And for all these images, if you stare at one image for a few seconds, your perception actually alternates between the two interpretations of the image. Another form of visual distability, another ambiguous figure, is what we call monocular rivalry. So in this case, there are two gradings, one black and green and one black and red, that are superimposed. And again, if you stare at this image here for a few seconds, you'll actually perceive either the green or the red grading. You have an alternation of the two interpretations of the image. I hope you'll had a chance to perceive this perception changing despite a constant image being presented on the screen. And actually, the characteristics of visual distability in general are three. The first is the transiency, what's called a transient, so that you cannot voluntarily hold one interpretation of the image into your visual awareness. that is transient, as you perceived before with the figures that I shown you. You cannot decide, now I just wanted to see the vase, or I only want to see the face, for example, in the Rubin's phase vase illusion, but your perception actually will alternate between the two interpretations, which is really the transient nature of visual vestibility. Another characteristic is that is inevitable. So once the conditions for visual vestibility occur, so once there is an image, you see an image that has two different interpretations, the alternation between the two images in your visual awareness is inevitable. Again, you cannot prevent that to happen. And from this follows also the exclusivity of the two interpretations. You cannot perceive the old lady and the young girl at the same time, but you perceive only one of the two at a time. That is, the two interpretations are mutually exclusive. You cannot really perceive them both at the same time. And these are, let's say, the general characteristics of visual vestibility. But I want to talk to you today actually about a particular form of visual vestibility that is called binocular rivalry. And binocular rivalry actually occurs at an earlier level. So the figures you've seen before, the ambiguous figures, actually what engages the competition is actually a high level interpretation of the image. In this case, in the case of binocular rivalry, the competition arises between monocular images, because binocular rivalry happens when two different images are simultaneously displayed to the two eyes. So for example, in this cartoon, you see that one eye receives the image of the grading, while the other eye receives an image of the grading that is oriented in orthogonal orientation. And when that happens, is that despite the fact that the two eyes receive a constant stimulation, a bit different, visual perception oscillates between the two monocular images. So your perception, you'll see what happens in this case, that you will perceive, like in this cartoon, for a couple of seconds, the grading tilted clockwards, and then that will be replaced. Now the cartoon has stopped while I'm saying that, but you've seen it before. So let's say the clockwise oriented grading will be replaced in visual awareness by the counterclockwise oriented gradings, and this continuous alternation, oscillation of visual awareness between the two monocular images will be gone for as long as the two different images are displayed to the two eyes. So in this case, we can say that really binocular rivalry is one peculiar case in which we have this dissociation between physical simulation that is constant in the two retinae and conscious perception that oscillates continuously between the two monocular images. And this is the reason why historically binocular rivalry actually has been used as a tool to investigate the neural correlates of visual awareness, because we have this dissociation. So this perception that is intrinsically unstable between the two images, and this dissociation between physical simulation and conscious perception has really been used to investigate the neural correlates of visual awareness, because when we perceived, for example, for example, like in this cartoon, we're perceiving the grading that is tilted clockwise. The orthogonal grading is presented to the eye, so it enters the visual system, but is completely suppressed, removed from visual awareness. And it's what is fascinating, and what I always think about binocular rivalry is that as if we were temporarily blind to one of the two eyes, because we only perceive one image at a time. But the image is presented to the retina, so the image actually enters the visual system, drives neural activity. And so researchers have been interested in understanding at which point of, which stage of visual processing visual awareness happens, where the suppression of one of the two eyes in binocular rivalry is released, and then there is the gate is open for visual awareness. And the last thing I want to tell in general about binocular rivalry is that many years of research have actually investigated the dynamics of binocular rivalry, and there are many phenomena that are the basis of the dynamics of binocular rivalry. And among them, there are reciprocal inhibition between the monocular signals, of course, but also adaptation, there is neural noise that underpin the dynamics of binocular rivalry. Binocular rivalry can be triggered, we've seen the case of orientation, but can be really triggered by all different forms of visual stimuli. So of course, as we've seen before, can be triggered by different orientation between the eyes, but also can occur just simply when different colors are presented to the two eyes, or also binocular rivalry can occur between higher level images. So for example, one widespread used stimulus in binocular rivalry is rivalry between a house and a face stimulus. And when we look a little bit at the dynamics of binocular rivalry, what has been historically used to quantify, let's say, the strength of each image of each eye in binocular rivalry is what is referred as a dominance phase. So we can model here the perception that oscillates between the two eyes. Here, the right eye, for example, presented with that vertical grading, and the left eye, for example, presented with the horizontal grading. We can model the perception oscillating between the two eyes in this way. And what we normally do, what we refer to as a dominance phase, is the moment in time, so the period of time in which the image presented to, for example, the right eye has been perceived by the subject. And so this, or in this case, in this dynamics, all these are the dominance phases of the right eye, and vice versa. They're all just interleaved with dominance phases of the left eye. And of course, while we have a dominance phase of one eye, at the same time, the other eye is suppressed. So let's say the dominance phase of the right eye corresponds to the suppression phase of the left eye, and vice versa. And what has been historically used to quantify the strength of the two eyes is simply the mean phase duration of each eye in binocular during an extended period of binocular rivalry. So clear? Okay. All right. And what I want to, one of the hallmarks actually of the dynamics of binocular rivalry is the distribution of the dominance phases. So this is the pioneering work of Levelt that has investigated deeply the relationship between the stimulus strength presented to each eye and the dynamics of binocular rivalry. And once we consider all the dominance phases that occur during a period of extended viewing of binocular rivalry over several minutes, we can take a look at how the duration of the phases for each eye are distributed. And what Levelt found is that actually the distribution of the dominance phases duration is well approximated, well modeled by a gamma distribution, and actually is a distribution that is skewed towards higher, let's say, dominance phases longer than the average. And the reason why I'm showing you this is not just for an historical reason, but it's really because for many, many years, and for when we're going to dip a little bit more into the controversy I want to talk to you about, the fact that the dominance durations are approximated by this gamma distribution has been really considered as an evidence that binocular rivalry is happening. And the last thing I want to tell you about the gamma distribution is that normally gamma distribution is kind of characterized as phenomena that are stochastic, that are unpredictable. And this is a bit the case also of the dominance durations. So actually, we cannot predict the duration of a dominance phase based on a history of the previous phase duration. So at each time, at each switch in perception between one eye and the other, we cannot really predict the dominance phase duration. Which made researchers think of the dynamics of binocular rivalry and visual instability in general as a stochastic process. Okay, going on and taking a look at what also Levelt discovered about binocular rivalry and what has been a bit of historically the hallmark of binocular rivalry as well. There are 4 propositions or 4 laws that are still called the Levelt laws that described the relationship between the strength of the visual stimuli and the dynamics of binocular rivalry. So the first proposition is that increasing the stimulus strength in one eye will increase the predominance of that stimulus. So there is a very strong relationship between the strength, so the low level strength of a stimulus, that might be the contour strength, the contrast, the luminance of the stimulus, and the dominance of that stimulus. So increasing the strength of the stimuli in one eye overall will increase the predominance of that eye. So if one eye receives a stronger stimulus, that eye will dominate for a longer period of time overall. But what is interesting, and what really is perhaps the most famous law that has been one of the most famous levels law, is the second law, because it states that actually increasing the stimulus strength in one eye does not affect the mean phase duration of that eye. This means that actually what happens, so the result that increasing the stimulus strength in one eye increases the overall predominance over the whole viewing period of binocular rivalry, it's actually due to a reduced suppression of the other eye. So let's say that we increase the strength, so the contrast, for example, of the stimulus presented to the right eye. What will happen is that actually the mean phase duration of the right eye will not change, but the mean phase duration of the other eye will be reduced. So what happens is that we increase the contrast, we increase the strength, and we reduce the suppression of that stimulus rather than increasing its dominance duration. And still, I mean, this Levelt has proposed these propositions and these dynamics of binocular rivalry in 1965 for the first time, and then summarized them in 1966. And there are still researchers that are trying to understand the relationship between contrast and stimulus strength and the dynamics of binocular rivalry. And in most of the times, the second proposition still holds. The third and the fourth proposition actually just derives from the first two. So there's increasing the stimulus strength in one eye will actually increase the alternation frequency. Of course, if we reduce the duration, the mean phase duration of the other eye, by increasing the stimulus strength of one eye, this will result in a faster alternation overall. And the fourth proposition is straightforward from what we've seen before. So it's simply that increasing the stimulus strength of both eyes increases the alternation frequencies. And so this is just, I don't want to go too much into the technical details of the paper or what has followed up, but I think it's something we should keep in mind also to understand the rest, what's coming next.
Sorry.
Yes, Alejandro, hi.
Hi, just to clarify quickly, these all four rules are independently from the dominance of your eye, right?
Yes.
So it changes at the same pace whether it is dominant or not.
If you mean your natural eye dominance, is that what you mean?
Yep.
Yeah, they're independent from that. Now, your natural eye dominant will be reflected, let's say, in a different dominance duration when the stimulus strength in both eyes is the same. And that will be, let's say, the baseline dominance duration of your eyes. So normally the eyes are quite balanced, but it's true that we all have a dominant eye, and that is reflected normally also in a difference in dominance durations during binocular rivalry. In fact, binocular rivalry can be used to model and actually to measure in a very sensitive way ocular dominance in humans. But since once you have your baseline dominance durations that will be affected by your eye dominance, then the proposition will still hold. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Good, thank you. Okay, so this was just to give you a little bit of a background on what binocular rivalry is and what are its dynamics. And now let's go directly to what the controversy is. And the controversy actually that has occupied researchers for about a decade is that what is about the neural basis of binocular rivalry. So where does binocular rivalry occur? Is it an early phenomenon or a late phenomenon? And the first theory, what is called early rivalry, also eye rivalry. And the first theory is that binocular rivalry actually results from competitions between monocular signals at the earliest stages of visual processing. And the other view, late rivalry, or what is called also stimulus rivalry, states instead that binocular rivalry results from competition between the representation not at the eye level, but at the stimulus level, so at a higher level of visual processing. And I'll start by going a bit into detail of the first theory, that what is called early or eye rivalry. And actually, this theory was first formalized by Randolph Blake in 1989 in his paper, The Neural Theory of Binocular Rivalry. And in this paper, Randolph Blake actually states his theory into 7 propositions. I won't have the time to go through all of them, but we'll just focus in the, let's say, the most important. So the first proposition is that binocular fusion takes precedence over binocular rivalry, which makes sense if the inputs that are presented to the 2 eyes are compatible, our brain automatically fuses them. And so basically fusion, it will be the first attempt of our brain will be to fuse the image of the 2 eyes. And then that has a precedence over binocular rivalry that will instead take over if the figures of the 2 presented to the 2 eyes are not compatible. And then they'll engage like a competition. Sorry, I've zoomed here in track. So anytime I have someone in a waiting room, it pops out in my PowerPoint. Okay, the second proposition says that rivalry suppression operates within the limited regions of the cortical image. And that, anyways, again, derives a bit from the first proposition as well. So actually, rivalry will be engaged only in those retinal location, and then also the cortical location, therefore afterwards, in which a conflict exists between monocular channels or monocular information, whereas it won't spread out to the rest of the cortical image, of the retinal image, when instead the figure in the images are compatible between the 2 eyes, because in that case, fusion would take precedence over binocular rivalry. The third proposition states that cortical net neurons vary in their ocular dominance, and this is nothing very new. It's actually based on the observation made in the 60s by so the seminal work of Hubel and Wiesel, which found that at the level of the primary visual cortex, neurons can be classified according to their ocular dominance. And so there are some neurons that are exclusively monocular, so they respond preferentially, or they respond only to the stimulus presented to one or the other eye. They're more in category 1 and 7 in this histogram. And then there are some other neurons that are considered to be binocular because they respond to inputs presented to both eyes. And from these 3 propositions, actually, Randolph Blake derived the 4th proposition, which is let's say the main proposition of the theory, the basis of the neural theory of binocular rivalry, and binocular rivalry being an early phenomenon, or eye rivalry for Randolph Blake. And the proposition states that actually are really those monocularly nerved cortical neurons that instigate binocular rivalry. So in the classic histogram by Hubel and Wiesel would be the neurons that fall into category 1 and 7. And I would like to just take a closer look at proposition 4 and go a bit into details, because this is really the proposition that is the base of the whole theory. So Randolph Blake starts by presenting different examples of what the behavior of monocular and binocular neurons will be in case of different types of visual stimulation. So in this figure, on the left panels, you have the stimulus conditions, so the stimuli that are presented either to the left or to the right eye. Then the representation of the stimuli, the activation at the level either of the left eye, the neurons, the monocular neurons responding to the left eye, the right eye, or both eyes for 2 different orientations, so horizontal and vertical. So in these first 2 cases, and then of course, sorry, in the right panels, you have the perception over time. So Randolph Blake starts by showing an example of just a monocular stimulation of either an horizontal or vertical grading. So when a vertical grading is presented to the right eye, for example, you'll have the cells, the monocular cells respond to the right eye and to the vertical orientations that will be activated, and the representation at the level of the binocular cells will simply represent the vertical orientation. And your perception will be simply vertical, very linear. Same holds in a case in which instead the horizontal orientation is solely presented to the left eye. In that case, you'll have the activation of the horizontally tuned neurons of the left eye and the horizontally tuned binocular neurons. And then it goes on, and that's okay. That's the beginning. Let's see another case. Let's say a case in which we present monocularly both orientations. So we present a grid. In this case, we have a grid. We present at the same time the vertical and the horizontal orientation. Well, in this case, to the left eye. In this case, we'll have the horizontally and the vertically tuned neurons, monocular neurons of the left eye will be activated. And also the binocular, horizontally and vertically tuned neurons will be activated. And your perception will not change over time. You'll still perceive a grid. And the same will hold if the grid was presented binocularly. If we presented a grid binocularly, so both eyes receive the same image of both orientations, so a grid, you'll have at the same time activated the horizontally and vertically tuned monocular neurons of both the right and the left eye, and the horizontally and the vertically tuned neurons, binocular neurons. But still, your perception won't change. You'll fuse the two eyes and you'll perceive a grid. And then let's take the case, it says, of binocular rivalry. So in the case in which we present to the left eye the horizontal orientation, and to the right eye, the vertical orientation. Well, in this case, at the level of the binocular cells, the activation will be exactly the same that we observe in the case of a grid, of the binocular grid. So the horizontally and the vertically tuned binocular neurons will be active at the same way in which they were active when we present a binocular grid. What changes is that only the monocular neurons, the only difference in your activation will be at the level of the monocular neurons, because the monocular neurons that respond to the right eye will be activated only for the horizontal orientation, and vice versa for the right eye. The monocular neurons will be activated only for the vertical orientation, and therefore rivalry will result actually by the competition between the monocular neurons, because at the level of the binocular neurons, it's impossible to distinguish these two cases, the cases in which we have a binocularly fused grid, or the cases in which there are the conditions to trigger binocular rivalry. Because of course, in this case, as you see in the diagram here, the perception over time, as we see for binocular rivalry, oscillates between the two. We cannot fuse the two percepts.
Claudia, another 5 minutes, is that going to be okay?
Oh my God. Sorry, I'm going very, very low.
It's okay. I think you've had just about 30. So if you can try to bring us somewhere in the next 5, thanks.
Yes. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to go, he proposes a neural model for this, in which there are basically a couple of inhibitory neurons that actually activate and operate at the level of the monocular channels in B1. Okay, I'm going to skip. I think this was the most important thing I want to tell you about the eye rivalry. And so I'm going to go skip a few slides and go directly just to tell you that there has been some evidence about competition in binocular rivalry, also the neural level occurring early. And this evidence comes from imaging studies that have shown that the dynamics, the hemodynamics, the both signals at the level of the primary visual cortex, but already at the level of the LGN can be modulated during binocular rivalry and modulated at the same time as perception, so reflecting the alternations in perception. And so there is some physiological support also in favor of the eye rivalry theory, of the early rivalry theory that has been initially proposed by Randolph Blake. But then something happened in 1996. So just 7 years after the paper of Randolph Blake on eye rivalry. And two different groups actually have provided some evidence against that, against the idea that binocular rivalry will happen only at the monocular level, and provided some evidence in favor instead of binocular rivalry occurring at the level of the stimulus representation. And I'm going to focus basically on two papers. And the first one appeared in 1996 in Nature by Logothetis, Leopold, and Scheinberg. And in their paradigm, Logothetis, Leopold, and Scheinberg proposed two different stimuli configurations. So they compared normal binocular rivalry, so a condition in which actually simply binocular rivalry is elicited between two orthogonal gratings that are flickered at 18 hertz. And there's a reason for that you're going to see in a while. Or a second condition with the called reversal condition, also swap rivalry, stimulus rivalry, in which actually 3 times per second, the orientation of the two stimuli is swapped between the eyes. So for about 300 milliseconds, the left eye will receive the counterclockwise oriented grading, and the right eye will receive the clockwise oriented grading. And after 300 milliseconds, the orientation between the two eyes will be swapped. So now the left eye receives the right tilted grading, and the left eye will receive the left tilted grading. And the flicker, actually, that is to kind of mask this eye swapping. So actually, the subject is not aware of the eye swapping. And so the question that Logothetis and colleagues ask is whether, if rivalry is actually driven by monocular at the level of the monocular neurons, your perception should alternate 3 times per second because it will follow the monocular signals. If otherwise binocular rivalry occurs at the later stage of processing, some form of grouping would take place, and so your perception would not alternate every 3 times per second, but the dynamics will be similar to normal rivalry. And to model and to compare the two conditions, they took advantage and they took a look at the distribution of phase durations. And what they found actually is that in both conditions, so in the non-reversal condition, the classic binocular rivalry, and the eye swapping condition, the reversal condition, the dynamics in the 3 subjects tested were exactly the same. So actually the average duration for mean phase durations in binocular rivalry was the same, whether or not the orientation was swapped between the eyes 3 times per second. Meaning that in that case, what is right for them, what they thought from what they explained in this paper is that what is rivaling during binocular rivalry is not really at the monocular level, so the 2 eyes, but the representation of the stimuli. So are the 2 orientations that are rivalry and not the 2 eyes, for example. And to a similar conclusion, actually, the same year in PNAS, Kovac and colleagues showed some form of grouping in binocular rivalry occurring at higher level using another paradigm, what is called patchwork rivalry. So what they did in this case was not to swap the orientation and the stimulus presented to the 2 eyes, but just to present a patchwork of 2 coherent images to the 2 eyes. So that, for example, in this case, the jungle with the writing or the face of the monkey could result only by integrating, by grouping the information across the eyes. And again, the question was, what happens to binocular rivalry under this stimulus configuration? Will perception alternate between the monocular images, or will perception alternate between the 2 coherent imaging grouping across the eyes? And so this what actually Kovac and colleague found, again, were that the dynamics were very similar, whether or not the condition for interocular grouping occurred. So actually, this again was done by simply comparing the gamma distribution, so the distribution, the mean phase durations distribution across the 2 conditions. And what they conclude is actually grouping occurred between the eyes for at least 50% of the time. So in this configuration, was tested with this colored dot, but just for a matter of simplification, we can think of the previous image with the face of the monkeys and the jungle. when we present this stimulus, we will, for 50% of the time, we will perceive actually an alternation between the face of the monkey and the jungle, which indicates that actually rivalry cannot occur simply at the monocular level, but it could occur at the at a higher level of processing, let's say, so at the level of the higher level representation of the image. And I'll just skip this one. And so this at this moment, this seems very confusing. I'm done. And there is I'll perhaps leave you to that. So and take questions. So these are the two different theories. And
okay, thank you, Claudia. Thank you very much. That's really detailed and meticulous summary of a field that at least I sort of know, but I don't know well. So it was really useful to have it spelled out so clearly. So perhaps let's see, let me get the chat window, and then let's see whether we have some specific questions on some specific queries.
I have a question.
Ivan, thank you.
Can I? So, hello, thank you. So I think in the paper they talk about how with attention you can kind of change the dominance. Like you can focus on one of them for a bit, so you can kind of modulate the image that you perceive. I think that's the case, right? That's it. With attentions.
Attention has an effect on binocular rivalry, and actually you need attention to have binocular rivalry. So when it comes to involuntary attention, the attention has a consistent effect on the binocular rivalry dynamics, but it's not huge. It's about prolongation about 10% of the phase duration of the attended stimulus.
So my question is not about attention. It's more about I was wondering whether there are any studies that look at whether any pharmacological manipulations change the, I don't know, it would be interesting to know, to see whether this distribution changes, or basically, to put it in layman terms, does being drunk change how, like the length or this transitions?
Well, being drunk, I don't know.
Okay.
But GABA.
Okay.
The GABA has been shown to play a big role in governing the dynamics of binocular rivalry.
Okay.
It has been shown both by measuring, by actually quantifying GABA at the level of the primary regional cortex, but also by pharmacologically modulating GABA using lorazepam. It has been shown that the more inhibited cortex will show, like, slow down the dynamics of binocular rivalry. Okay. And I will guess that alcohol will do the same, because it acts on the same receptor as the GABA receptor. Okay. If you're interested in pharmacological, there is also a study showing the effects of psilocybin on binocular rivalry.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be interested in reading that paper.
I can put a link in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, Nicola. Is there evidence of prefrontal cortex being involved? Because some people say it's needed for conscious perception.
Absolutely. All the network, the prefrontal and also the parietal network, that is also the attentional network, is involved in binocular rivalry, and it's actually involved not at the initial level of competitions, but actually in what is a higher level of governing the switching dynamics. So at the level of the perceptual decision. So it has been recently shown using different paradigms that can rely or not rely on the report of the participants, that the frontoparietal network is activated when actually you ask participants to report their perception. But you can also measure, there's a way of measuring binocular rivalry without asking the report, that is by using reflexive eye movements. And in that case, the prefrontal cortex is not activated. So the activation of the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex are related more to the perceptual decision rather than the, let's say, lower level effect of binocular rivalry, so lower level perception. It's more at the decisional level.
Can I make a comment here?
Please, Janice. Yeah, go.
So actually, because we are working with this paradigm using electrophysiological recordings in monkeys, and I mean, we have some recent findings, I mean, still in a preprint form, but apparently we exposed these animals to no report binocular rivalry using a direction of motion rivalry paradigm, and we actually recorded neural populations in the prefrontal cortex, and it's quite impressive that we can actually decode what is perceived using the eye movements. The optokinetic reflects as an objective measure of perception, so we can still decode the percept even when the monkeys do not report. So this is kind of contradictory to the fMRI studies, which, I mean, it could be due to the signal to noise. It could be due to the different nature of the two signals. I mean, there are many reasons that we might have this difference. But yeah, the other thing that I want to point out is that, I mean, again, from the field of electrophysiology, I remember that Nikos had a paper. Apparently, I think it was approximately during the same time that he published the psychophysics paper, and they actually recorded from neurons in V1 during binocular rivalry. Of course, back then it was they were using report, but if I remember correctly, they found that first of all, that most of the neurons in V1, or at least a large percentage of the neurons, they fire more when the preferred stimulus is suppressed, actually, which means that they don't convey an explicit representation of the conscious content. And then the other finding that I remember was quite interesting was that it was not only monocular neurons. So there are actually quite a lot of binocular neurons in V1. And these neurons were also found to kind of fire in correlation with the percept. So it's, I think this, I mean, my feeling is that this monocular view is probably not very, very well, supported from experimental findings, at least.
There is a big difference between the controversy also between electrophysiological recording in monkeys and fMRI studies in binocular rivalry. That can be for many reasons. If I'm not wrong, of course, that's a paper inside of Nikos Logotheris came out at the same time as the psychophysical paper in '96. But I think that more recently, Kaiser showed using in monkeys, kind of using local field potential recordings, it could replicate the results that were found in V1 with fMRI. And so that's showing that kind of, I mean, of course, local field potential recordings are more similar at the population level. I don't want to say things that I'm not too sure about, and I'm not, I don't remember the exact reference, but I can find it. I think that controversy has been a little bit resolved in more recent times, but it's true that the monocular level, I think it's like the original theory that rivalries only involves monocular neurons no longer stands, and that we're going towards a more hierarchically integrated model.
So we're a bit out of time, but I do want to ask the question. There are actually loads of questions going on in the chat. I can't keep up, but I do want to ask the question that Clément Pellier has put, because you showed right at the beginning these objects like the Rubin vase and the girl woman and so on. And Clément is asking, is there a link between this kind of oscillation of bistable figures and the high-level rivalry you've described for the binocular, like the Kovács type work?
Absolutely, and actually there is a link between all the kind of bistabilities, forms of visual bistabilities, in which, let's say that the intrinsic dynamics that every person has, so let's say the oscillation rate, will correlate across the different forms of visual distabilities. So there's actually is considered to be an ultradian rhythm for every person. And of course, the mechanism, perhaps the neural mechanisms that underlie what is like the interocular grouping rivalry, is called interocular grouping rivalry, and I like higher level, like ambiguous figures might be more close compared to each other compared to lower level binocular rivalry.
Claudia, thanks. That's really good. That's really good.
Sorry, sorry I went over time.
No, don't worry, don't worry. We did great, and there are lots of questions still in the chat, which maybe we can come back to now. I think what we should do is take a very rapid sort of 1-2 minute break, and then